Chris Fredericks, welcome to Acquiring Minds.
Thanks for having me on, Will.
I've been looking forward to our conversation here, Chris. It's going to be especially interesting and educational. You are the founder and CEO of Empowered Ventures, a Holdco, and a Holdco structured as an ESOP, or Employee Stock Ownership Plan. Now, we hear about ESOPs in passing on Acquiring Minds, but I don't think I've ever deep dived on the topic, let alone an ESOP Holdco. Let's get into it. Where does this story begin, Chris?
We could probably start in my childhood in a sense. I grew up in a family construction company. My dad and his 7 siblings built and ran, a regional successful construction, firm. My dad was the commercial roofing, leader, and I ended up, working on roofs as part of that, in high school and stuff. And I developed kind of an appreciation and understanding of entrepreneurialism and family business. And I think that influenced me in a lot of ways that I'm still, uncovering now, but ultimately led to, an interest in being in small business and private companies and stuff.
Chris, did it not also give you an insight into family business and perhaps the complications there?
It did lots. There is all the typical stuff, a lot of appreciation and love for and great memories of family business, and definitely some of the common hardships. There are multiple brothers in the business. One brother was chosen over another brother at one point to lead the company, all this stuff. And I learned a lot from that as well, that, I ended up choosing to kind of steer clear of going into the family business, even though 2 of my brothers did, or my 2 brothers did, and many of my cousins ended up in the business as well. And I think that's awesome and great. I'm very proud of the company. But I'm glad that that wasn't my path for a variety of reasons. And so that's really where, for me, the story begins. I think one key insight that I realized with reflection eventually was I was really proud to work with these blue collar folks, and I got this really deep sense of gratitude. These were folks that actually were proud to work for this company, and the company did treat them really well as employees. For example, during the Great Recession of 08-09, no one was laid off. And this is in a business that definitely had some challenges. And eventually they actually provided 100% healthcare for all the employees. And this is a non-union, construction shop. So they were really ahead of their time. They cared about their people, still do. So it's a business I'm proud of. I also kind of came out of that with a really conflicting sense of I grew up pretty well off, upper middle class, because of the effort of all these, blue collar folks. And they were, even though they had 100% healthcare covered and everything, they were typically, kind of living to paycheck. And I would say a little bit of guilt was there for me of I'm really doing well because of the efforts of all these people, and they're not maybe fully benefiting from the fruits of their labor. So I think that was a thread that eventually I uncovered that for sure has influenced how I think about things today.
Great context, Chris. So instead of going into the family business, what path did you choose?
I just did the typical CPA accounting path initially. Went to IU Bloomington, got an accounting degree. That's what a career counselor said I should do because I had the personality of an accountant, apparently. So I did it.
Prove them wrong, Chris.
Yeah,
Prove them wrong.
Right. It resonated when I went into my first accounting class. The professor actually said, 90% of you are going to hate this class. That means you shouldn't go into accounting. 10% of you are going to enjoy it. You're probably the accountants. And I did enjoy my first accounting class. So
there you go.
I ended up in public accounting. I enjoyed it. 4 years, good foundation for kind of, a career in my opinion, but pretty quickly realized it's probably not the career I wanted to build. And I did start to get the itch of entrepreneurialism. I even started looking at, franchises, could I buy a really small business? I was young. I had no idea what I was doing. This is, early 2000s. So there wasn't this community around ETA and stuff. So I didn't find other people with that kind of mindset. So I ended up just taking a mid-level accounting role in a privately owned company that I thought would be a good, step into the private, the business world, and get my hands dirty.
And this was TVF?
TVF, a fabric distribution business based in Carmel, Indiana, started in the 70s. And like I said, it was a recruiter just called me and said, "Hey, I've got a role that you might be interested in." And I ended up taking it.
Great. Sorry, this is what year?
So this would have been 2005.
2005. So you were what? Mid, early 20s still?
Yeah, I was probably 26. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. Well, TVF is, spoiler for the audience, still a business that you are in. It was the foundation of the Holdco. So
Yes.
Going back to 2005 here is relevant. So start connecting the dots for us. What happens at TVF?
My career progressed really quickly at TVF. So I was hired in as assistant controller. My boss, the controller of the company, he quit within a year. So pretty immediately, they gave me the chance to just step into his shoes and work directly with the owner, which I hadn't been to that point in the first year. And I kind of took that chance and ran with it. I just poured myself into the role, tried to improve everything I could. In an accounting sense, I just made the month-end close as efficient and short as possible. I started providing insights to the owner into the numbers that maybe he wasn't seeing before. And I just really took a run at it, so to speak, and it worked really well. So the business owner and founder, his name is Dick Hansel. He definitely started viewing me as, let's say, a high potential person pretty quickly, and started giving me even more interesting work to do, special projects. He had a side business completely separate from the textile company that had grown to be over 100 million in revenue, a scrap metal division.
Nice side business.
Yeah, side business, right? And it was needing attention. So there was a founder of that kind of division, and they needed support in terms of systems, accounting, et cetera. So I stepped in and kind of shifted my attention to 100% to the scrap metal business for a good 2-year period, to kind of solidify that. A lot of stuff happened. Long story short, we ended up needing to divest that company. So in 2008, I worked with the founder to divest the scrap metal business, and then at that point he actually promoted me to CFO, and we started talking
of TVF.
So now it was just TVF again. Yep.
And Chris, $100 million scrap metal business. So was that larger in size than TVF, or was TVF itself over 100 million?
At that point, it was probably about more than double TVF in terms of revenue. Being a scrap metal company, it was a thin margin business. This was a lot of brokerage, not as much, a large physical operation other than some processing, but there was a lot of brokerage happening. So it was a thin margin, very large volume kind of business. Yeah.
Okay. So TVF was 50-ish million, but much higher margin.
Less than that, significantly less than that at that point.
Significantly less than 50 million. Okay.
Yes.
And TVF is a textile business. What does TVF do exactly?
Yeah. TVF is an importer, distributor mostly of textiles, and a converter. So they'll work with, some US plants to kind of finish textiles, but the vast majority of the products that TVF sells are imported finished goods, rolls of fabric that go into dozens of industries. So anything from medical to performance apparel, tarp, like heavy duty tarp material for trucks and trailers, bag fabrics, all the nylons and polyesters that go into, bags and gear, outdoor gear. So a very large variety of products and end user industries that TVF is dealing in. And all the customers then are like small manufacturers throughout the United States, essentially.
Great. So these small manufacturers who are the producer of the end consumer product end consumer product get their
The rolls of
fabrics, their
fabric from
textiles, their
TVF,
rolls,
so-
their raw rolls from you guys, and you guys
Yep.
will have basically distributed them or added value to them in some way. Used the word finishing, I think.
Converting and finishing. And that's a
Converting and
chunk
finishing.
of the business at times. So, but a lot of it also is just bringing them in fully finished, ready to sell. And so it's a pretty pure distribution type business in many ways.
Okay, great. Thank you. Carry on with the plot. So we're back at TVS has divested itself of the scrap metal business, and you're back at TVF focused on that exclusively.
I'm at TVF and I've become promoted. I've been promoted to CFO at this point. And Dick Hansel's major project at that point that was increasingly an issue and a concern was what is he going to do with the business? He was definitely getting up in age at that point, had some health issues starting to come into play, didn't have family in the business. And he had a few failed attempts to kind of do an ownership type buyout or bring, or management buyout and bring managers into the ownership structure. And those fell apart. So he was feeling really gun shy about what to do with the business. He did not want to sell it into competition or a strategic. He really didn't want to sell to a financial buyer, private equity or whatever. He wanted this business that was his life's work to continue largely as is, but just didn't feel like he had a clear option. So he actually asked me to help him figure out kind of his succession plan, essentially. And we started exploring, whether I could potentially, be a buyer in the business for a variety of reasons. It wasn't going to pencil and work. I was green. I was 32, 33 years old at this point. And I don't think I was really ready to take on something like that. I didn't have a group of investors that would back me. So we started looking at other options and kind of stumbled across ESOP. So our accounting firm was actually an ESOP-owned accounting firm, and had an ESOP practice as well. So that was something they were always, top of mind for them, is to look for opportunities for companies to become ESOPs. And they recommended it. And after investigating it, I learned a lot about it in a short period of time and was really excited about it as the potential solution for Dick, and recommended it. And luckily he went for that path. So for over about
let me stop you there, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
So give us the definition, please, of an ESOP, and let's start there.
Great. So an ESOP is, as you said, an employee stock ownership plan. It's actually an ERISA-sponsored retirement plan, very much like a 401k. It functions with almost all the same types of rules and regulations, but it purchases the corporate stock, company stock, and holds it in a trust. And then the stock is allocated to all the employees over a period of time, slowly, as a benefit to the employees. So essentially a separate trust is set up to purchase the stock from the business owner. And again, it just kind of sits in suspense. And then over time, a small percentage annually gets allocated to everyone's accounts.
Mm-hmm. And those allocations are worth what? How does do I, as an employee in an ESOP, actually see cold hard cash?
Yeah, eventually, once folks leave, so retire or leave the business, their account becomes available to them to be paid in cash. So the stock is purchased back from the employee at that point. During the years where they're employees, they receive an annual statement that shows, last year's total number of shares, the additional shares allocated that year, and then a share price. And the share price is determined annually by an independent valuation firm. And it's typical kind of valuation work that goes into that. So DCFs and, comps to comparable, businesses and things kind of all go together to determine the annual value of the company, and then divided by total shares. And it's a share price that shows up on the statement. So in ESOP world, employees typically get very excited to hear about what's the new share price. It's always a big reveal and a big, hopefully a celebration when it goes up. But that's, those statements then come out shortly after, and they see, how their account grows over time.
And so everybody in the organization knows what the share price is.
Correct.
Sort of thing. I mean, it's a currency of the culture, if you will.
Absolutely.
And again, you can't you as an employee in an ESOP cannot. And by the way, the language is ESOP owned company. Is that how you say it, or just
totally
an ESOP?
Fair. An ESOP or an ESOP employee-owned company is going to, in the U.S. especially, the vast majority of employee-owned companies are ESOPs. There are other forms of employee ownership like co-ops and some other things, but ESOP is the predominant player in the U.S.
Okay, great. So if I'm an employee in an ESOP and I see that my shares in the business are worth X, I can only monetize that at my exit of the company,
Correct.
either taking another job or retiring.
Yes. And to be clear, this is a benefit, not something they buy, which is sometimes a misconception. Even when people join our company, they're not required to put money in to purchase these shares. These are allocated as their retirement benefit, usually instead of a 401k match or, a company sponsored, 401k contribution.
That part I didn't realize, but we'll get there in a second.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing to be really clear on, you just said it, this is a benefit. This is not some sort of, what's the word? Altruistic, charity, socialisty thing.
Right.
This is really a way of structuring a benefit for employees.
Yes.
Like you said, like you might compare it to a 401k plan that is much more tightly, directly tied to performance and value of the overall enterprise. And so I guess that begs the question, again, keeping the 401k to the side for a minute, why is this different than traditional Silicon Valley style direct stock ownership?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
stock
it's
options.
different. Yeah, mm-hmm. It's different in that it's usually more widely shared. So in, Silicon Valley type stock option plans, it's not always all the, employees that are necessarily getting that opportunity. Sometimes it is. And really the difference I would say is that the stock options are a fit when the intent is to significantly grow a business. And it's a bet on significant growth versus a real amount of value that's guaranteed essentially, or, allocated steadily over time. ESOPs are almost always a great fit for companies that have a long history of steady performance, are likely to continue to grow steadily into the future, but not necessarily a big bet on massive growth per se. And that's why it's almost like a barbell approach, it seems like, in the way employee shares get allocated in the world. It's kind of the venture style, high growth, high risk, on the one end, and then on the far end, kind of a steady, slow growth approach is a good fit for ESOPs. Yeah.
Which also notably maps to the styles of investment in these two categories. Venture capital, which
Totally.
is, 20 bets, 19 go to zero or are singles, and the one is the one that carries the fund. And then on the other end of the spectrum, private equity, our space, which is investing in proven companies that are more steady and already have inherent value that can be borrowed against, for example, to do an LBO. So this feels like a similar kind of two counterparts: stock options on the risk on businesses versus ESOPs on the tried and true businesses.
That's a great way to put it.
Great. Now returning to the 401k bit. So the argument is also that the business will outperform the stock market, because wouldn't I, as an employee considering participating or getting hired by an ESOP, I would have to say to myself, I think the value, I think the value of my share in the ESOP is going to be worth more than whatever a 401k invested in the S&P 500 is after my tenure at this business.
Yeah, it's a little bit of that. Yes. It's not just that. So a typical 401k benefit in most companies is, I would say is probably in that 4 to 6% range company contribution. An ESOP is definitely going to be higher than that on average. So the average ESOP is probably in the 10 to 12% range. And many ESOPs, including ours, actually have a much higher benefit level than even the 10 to 12%. So,
and sorry, Chris, what is this percentage of?
So the benefit level, right? So Using the
Of
401k
salary.
as an example, it's 4 to 6% of salary is that, let's say, the annual contribution the company makes. ESOP, the equivalent concept is a percentage of salary that essentially goes to gets allocated as company stock. And so it's the same benefit level percentage concept in both cases. And it's, double, triple, or many multiples of the common 4 to 6% is what's going to be seen in most ESOP companies.
So my salary is $100,000 in a traditional 401k style benefit plan. Company contributes 5%, $5,000 into my 401k versus in ESOP land, the convention, I'm going to press on that, but the convention is much more than 5%, 10% or above. So the end of a year, I'm getting $10,000 or likely more of company stock.
Yeah. So even if the stock performs equal to, let's say, S&P 500, you're still coming out way ahead because you're starting with a higher, just allocation of value throughout the years.
And so why is it so much more generous, this benefit percentage in ESOP land?
Because because the employees actually own the company. Well, because there's no other owners, or the ESOP owns, a portion of the company, a significant portion of the company. So in our case, we have no investors, we have no owners other than the ESOP. So all the real equity value is ultimately going to funnel through this benefit and go to the employee owners when they leave the company.
Sorry, but I don't understand still why it's necessarily therefore higher, the benefit at 10% or more a year versus 5% in 401k land. Mm-hmm. I missed that.
Yeah, it's trying to connect the dots. So in a 401k, there's, the business owner, not the employees, not the ESOP, just a typical owner is going to decide how much of their budget they want to assign to this benefit. And then the profits of the company then ultimately go to the owner in whatever form, distributions, salary, whatever. In an ESOP, the profits that are ultimately left over. So there is no cash benefit in an ESOP. So on an annual basis, you're not receiving cash, you're receiving shares. So on an annual basis, the cost of the benefit is actually zero on the income statement. The benefit itself is the equity of the company. So it's the value, though, annually of the number of shares you do receive in your account times the share price of that year typically is going to work out to be a much, much higher benefit than this 401k. It's just an entirely different value because it's really taking equity and spreading it out as an allocation over time.
Yeah. Whereas in a 401k, that benefit value is being taken right from the profits of the company, which is essentially right from the pocket of the owners of the company. And it's sort of zero sum in that way.
Correct.
Okay. Let's leave it there. We're going to return to the topic and continue to unpack ESOPs later in the conversation. But just tie this back now to the plot. What exact problem? We understand that your boss at the time, Dick Hansel, was having a hard figuring out his succession, having a hard time figuring out how to sell, how to manufacture his own exit from this business in a way that didn't want to sell it to strategic, didn't want to sell it to private equity. The ESOP provided the solution. How was it the solution? Spell that out. All the what boxes was it checking there?
Yeah, specific to Dick, there was really two big things. One is he wanted to have a sense that the current leadership and his current approach to kind of this business would essentially continue with some changes, of course, but that a buyer that he doesn't know isn't going to come in and kind of bring a new vision to the company. That was one big one. He would have had a hard time finding an outside buyer that he could trust with his life's work. The other piece that's highly related and still isn't kind of in the realm of charity at all in Dick's mind is he wanted to have some amount of control going forward while any seller notes or remaining consideration gets paid out. And with an ESOP sale, it's actually very easy to ensure that the selling owner maintains a level of control, either for a long time or however long, makes sense for the business. And that's something that is really easy to accomplish with ESOPs. So that's why Dick actually in particular was very happy with that outcome.
And what are the mechanics of him retaining control even post conversion to an ESOP?
He was able to negotiate with, so in an ESOP, there's a trustee that's hired to actually negotiate the sale with the business owner. So it's a true arm's length transaction. And as part of that, Dick was able to negotiate a level of control in terms of a board seat. And if, let's say, any kind of default happens on his seller note, an ability to take control of the board, essentially. So just ways that he was able to kind of structure into the terms themselves that he's still ultimately going to have the say as long as he's owed any money from the sale.
And just to be clear, you say it's arm's length, you hire a trustee, but of course he's who represents the trust in now the ESOP on the other side of the table, but he's doing the hiring of that trustee.
That is the really weird part about ESOPs. When they get formed, the business owner pays for everything in terms of the transaction costs on both sides, and has to hire a trustee that then they have to negotiate with. So it can be an odd process to go through. But there are trustees and there are valuation advisors or M&A advisors that specialize in ESOPs and have built a lot of best practices around all of this that make it, an efficient and effective process. But it is an odd, process for a business owner to go through for sure.
Another key feature of ESOPs that I think might be relevant here, which you had explained to me in the pre-call, the ESOP component of an ESOP isn't necessarily 100% of the equity of the stock. In fact, you I guess when you set it up, determine that. Is that relevant here because he retained, he only converted 80% of the stock to an ESOP or something? Talk us through that.
Yeah, some ESOPs will do it in tranches. So they may even start with a minority 30% sale, then over time do another tranche, and then eventually get to 100. Some stay a minority for forever, ESOP percentage. In our case, we went straight to 100% with the sale. Oh. And that was largely driven by Dick's desire to transition fairly quickly. So we did a 100% sale. It was funded with largely a seller note because we already had utilized a working capital line of credit to the point that additional bank leverage probably wasn't going to provide enough liquidity. So Dick was comfortable selling on with a seller note on the transaction. And then, it took us 4 years to pay off this 8-year seller note. And that highlights something that I forgot to bring up earlier as far as why ESOPs can be a useful solution. We became a 100% owned S Corp ESOP. And that means we became a 100% tax deferred entity as soon as this transaction happened. The business became owned by a tax deferred retirement plan. So there's no need at that point going forward for us to do any sort of tax distributions that are related to corporate profits. So that additional, let's say 40% of cash flow from not paying taxes provided funding to pay off the seller note really quickly over those 4 years.
This preferential tax treatment of an ESOP, let's return to that because that is a key benefit and one that I think offsets what will be perceived as a downside of ESOPs. So to be clear, where does the money come from to buy Dick out? He seller financed the whole thing.
Correct.
With an 8-year amortized loan over 8 years. So he was going to get his payout over 8 years. But you all actually paid him down in 4. And the reason was in this case, because you had this new cash flow, because you weren't paying taxes, because you had this better tax treatment. So you had basically the business immediately became more profitable, profits that paid Dick off faster. Down
Correct.
Dick's selling out faster. Fascinating. Okay. And in general, does it have to work like that? Because otherwise, where does the cash, if I sell to my employees or to convert to an ESOP and effectively sell to the employees, where else would the cash come from if I'm not financing the whole thing?
Yeah, a business that doesn't have much debt at the time of an ESOP sale can find senior lenders that are happy to lend to ESOPs, because the senior lenders that understand how ESOPs work also see this tax benefit as, good for them. And further, even in the case of someone like in our situation, there are now there's a growing number of investors and even some private equity firms that will provide mezzanine level financing to ESOP transactions as a way to take out a chunk or all of the seller debt portion. So there are liquidity. There's lenders essentially that do like ESOPs a lot and focus on the space that can participate in the initial transaction to create liquidity for sellers.
Define mezzanine for the audience, please.
Mezzanine meaning, subordinated debt to senior. So, yeah.
Great. And so could you just walk us through a hypothetical of what you just described?
Yeah. So say a business has $2 million in cash flow and is valued at 5 times. So it's going to transact for $10 million to sell 100% to an ESOP. And let's say this business has no debt. Maybe it'd be pretty easy to find a senior lender if it's a solid business to do a 2 times, amount of debt on that. So that's, let's say, a $4 million loan that could go to fund the actual transaction and be cash that funnels through to the seller as part of the sale. And then a mezzanine lender might add another 2 times on that. So another $4 million of cash that could go to the seller. And then maybe there's still a $2 million seller note sitting at the end of the transaction.
Great. Very helpful. Thank you. Okay. This is fantastic, Chris. All right. So what year is it now when you convert to an ESOP?
2010.
2010. Okay. Right. Here we are in 2025. So that was 15 years ago. We're not, and the story doesn't, maybe accelerate until closer to now than in those early years. But do give us a little bit of the story from, in the teens. I know there were some hard times, and you were named CEO. Did we? Yes,
we didn't mention that. Yeah. So as part of the transaction, I also became president of the company. Yeah, which was exciting for me as 33-year-old, accountant. It was really fun and exciting.
Yeah. Great. So maybe give us a window into that time of TVF's life and your own.
Yeah. So from 2010 to 2020, let's say TVF was the ESOP still. The ESOP owned TVF and the business was TVF. And we had a great, decade. Mostly there were some really challenging moments throughout, of course, but the business essentially doubled its revenue over that 10-year period and tripled its profitability. And that created some phenomenal outcomes, in a number of ways, obviously strengthening the balance sheet and creating a lot of cash flow and assets for us to figure out what we wanted to do with eventually, which led ultimately to Empowered Ventures, but also just created really incredible outcomes for our employee owners. You can imagine that that level of growth translated into the share price was pretty phenomenal. And by the end of that 10-year period, folks were looking at ESOP account values that were, let's say, 4 times their annual compensation, which pretty incredible, just that 10-year period. And that also enabled a pretty significant culture shift to take place within TVF. It was always a business where people were proud to work there and worked really hard. It became a business where the pride of ownership, of employee ownership, became just really high. The level of engagement, the belief in what we're doing, the belief in employee ownership, the culture shift was phenomenal and a lot of fun to be part of.
Well, say more about that, Chris, because in theory, again, just traditional stock options or just holding equity in a business should have the same effect. As you pointed out earlier, two caveats to that would be in startup land, it's basically people treat it as a lottery ticket. It's not really. I mean, it probably incentivizes some people, but these days it's almost expected. You go to a startup and it's like, well, how much equity am I getting, or what do my stock options look like? But it's a lottery ticket, so the chances that are worth something are far less than 50-50, frankly. I believe that's right. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. First, second, not everybody has equity, and certainly in small businesses, usually just ownership and maybe management has equity, not all the way down the hierarchy. So I'm a little skeptical that equity can be the motivator that it is in theory. But it sounds like in the case of an ESOP, or at least in the case of TVF as ESOP, it worked beautifully. So please, you've already said it, but maybe elaborate.
Yeah, and I think people should be skeptical about, for the reason you're saying, that just giving someone equity, even in an ESOP, changes the culture. There are many ESOP companies where the culture is not different than what it would be without the ESOP. And it's a common topic in ESOP kind of community that there are important levers to pull to make it real, that just providing this benefit does not change and can actually be counterproductive in many ways if things aren't done, other things aren't done to support this. So really it's things like, embracing more democratic sharing of information, not democratic decision-making, meaning we're not going to vote on everything. That's not a thing that most ESOPs do. But are we being more transparent? Are we involving everyone in a way in the direction of the company, giving them a real voice in the business? So some folks may have heard of Great Game of Business as a book that's an example of a really powerful way to kind of bring voice to the employees. It's something that can be done even if you don't have an ESOP, but ESOP companies take this. Generally, ESOP companies that want to have a different, truly empowered sort of culture, they take this to a next level, and that's something we started early on. Right away, we immediately started sharing information that we weren't sharing before. Things like financial literacy, business literacy becomes a topic in ESOPs. We started educating on how the P&L works. Like there's a journey of $1 that we talk about. Like, okay, cool. Yeah, we bring $1 in, but half of it goes to the cost of goods. That's out the door, and then this much goes out for salaries and that's out the door. And you just work it down and show everybody that we're doing great, but this tiny percentage is all that's left over. So what are we going to do to make that higher? So there's a lot of work that can be done to really make this real, but it takes time and it takes effort.
And it sounds like it's very much related to information sharing, be that transparency or explicit education.
Absolutely. Yep.
Now, of course, all sounds good in theory. One of the key reasons, there are probably many, but first that comes to mind in traditional organizations that there isn't that level of sharing is owner doesn't want employees to know that he's making a few $1 million a year. That would create resentment. Is that just something you live with in ESOP land, or in fact does president, for example, earn less? Is there also kind of is there a tighter band of salaries and earnings that occurs either explicitly or organically?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think ESOPs writ large, and it's true in our case, the executives of the business, the leaders of the business are going to not make as much money as if they owned the company themselves. That's just true because this benefit truly is the equity that everybody is sharing in. But there are ways that most ESOPs view the leadership of the company as needing to have upside that is equivalent to their role. So a lot of times professional studies are utilized to do compensation studies to identify what's a market compensation package for this size of a company for a CEO role. If someone were to go hire a CEO for their business, how would they target a compensation, outcome for that person? It's very much the same approach. It could also be thought of as like public company light. So public companies, the CEOs, they don't own the majority of the business. They have some sort of upside if it's stock options, or there's synthetic stock plans that are utilized sometimes, where some amount of shares are synthetically, given to an executive and then maybe vest over time as a way to create a cash compensation upside. So there's lots of ways to structure it, but executives are generally given upside to ensure that there's direct alignment between the ESOP, growing the ESOP value, and the compensation of the executive. Great.
And that sounds good, but just to tease out something you said at the top, that executive's not likely to earn as much as an owner, because for the simple reason that an owner, let's say that's a single owner, owns 100% of the equity. So all of the value of the organization is on their balance sheet. That by the very nature of an ESOP is not going to be the case here. So that enormous pop, the $8 million, let's call it, or the 8 year, whatever Dan's liquidity event was, would not happen.
Yeah, conceptually, one way to think about it would be the difference between in the ETA world, being the person that buys 100% of a company versus the one that brings in a meaningful group of investors. If investors are going to be the 75% or 80% owner, and you're going to be the person that leads the company, and you have a smaller tranche with upside, it's going to be something more akin to that as an ESOP versus the other.
Well, but independent sponsors under that kind of traditional private equity framework often do a lot better than an SBA owner who owns 100%.
So yeah, that's exactly.
Okay. So levers to pull to make an ESOP a success. I'm sure there are many, and people can do their homework, but key among them would be transparency and education. So you really got buy-in. The organization really understood how the business worked, and it really motivated them. So it did what it was supposed to do, in theory, in practice. Fantastic. Anything, Chris, this is not related to the ESOP, I don't think. Anything to say about your difficult moments? You've had some fetal position moments, bit of an aside, but the hardship of small business is also a theme of this podcast. So I invite you to share anything if you think there's a story there.
Yeah, it's definitely not been an easy and just straight up, outcome for me personally. Becoming the 33-year-old leader of this, 40-year-old business involved a lot of growth that I needed to go through. In the first couple of years, for example, we really wanted to grow a new program and then focus on a new industry. And to do that, we hired an outside executive that had experience in that industry. And I made a series, I would say, of, in hindsight, obvious mistakes that ended up being extremely stressful. And for a couple years, really was a setback for the company and for me, but ultimately extremely important learning. Specifically, hiring someone that's a good fit for the culture. I brought in someone to lead this new program that was a terrible fit for our culture, and it brought tremendous stress to everyone that was trying to support that person and building this new program. And then I made the second mistake, which was not trusting my intuition. As soon as I had a sense this was a terrible fit, I tried to make it work for another year, and it just continued to deteriorate and truly drove me to therapy and to getting a business coach, because I realized I was trying to manage all this on my own. Everything, I felt like it was all on my shoulders, and I wasn't as transparent as we were becoming with some numbers and some things throughout the business. I wasn't sharing the responsibility. I was owning it too much almost. And just learning it's taken me a long time to open up and realize I have support. That was my first moment of I have a board of directors that they're there to help me succeed. I have coworkers that also are owners. I can trust them to help me figure this out. I don't have to figure it all out on my own. That was a brutal moment, and truly one of those, am I going to get through this? Am I capable of this? And I think about that often still today.
And it was triggered by this bad hire.
Just a bad hire, an executive who never should have been part of our company, and then trying to make it work and not making the quick decision to just cut bait. That was the main issue with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the cliche hire slow, fire fast, you know, that you can kind of, what is meant by that cliche is that you can tell pretty quickly if somebody's not going to work. But I will say, though, that a new hire, particularly an executive hire, is we could abstract that and call it an investment. It's an investment that you've made. And it is hard in all life and business to know when to cut bait on a bad investment, because sometimes investments take a while to turn around. Do you feel like you have learned something?
I think it's a great point. I mean, the sunk costs issue is very much part of this. It ended up being a successful program for the company. Once we let that person go, we appointed someone from inside the company to continue to lead it. So it's not that it was ultimately a bad outcome even, but the learning for me was real. Like, I agree. There's no need to necessarily Monday morning quarterback and say I should have done it differently. I wasn't capable of doing it differently. But what would I do differently going forward? Yeah. The values alignment wasn't there. Like, how to treat people. We were trying to build a company where we treat each other with a high level of dignity and kindness while holding each other accountable to results. The person we brought in, frankly, was not a person who treats other people with kindness and dignity. So as a culture, learning about how to make sure you're not sacrificing any element of your culture for theoretical financial upside was the main lesson for me.
Great. And Chris, let's tie together some points there. The dignity, a word that I've heard you use a couple times, use it in the pre-call, the context that you gave for your whole career of being the child in a family of a prosperous small business family, where they're blue collar people doing the work, doing the actual service delivery, and feeling some sort of tension with that. And then, of course, the ESOP, and enabling, in your case, all of your employees to benefit more fully financially from this enterprise. Tie it all together there, please.
I don't know when this started, but I've always had some sense of the importance of work in our lives, right? I mean, early on, I had that sense of that maybe as part of the construction company family, experience, but it seems to me that work is where a lot of people go to find some purpose and meaning. And that's a cliche, but we spend so much time at work. It's almost a tragedy to me that there are still so many people out there that dread their work experience. And dread, can be on the one spectrum as awful as child labor or whatever in third world countries, like, versus just in a prosperous country like ours, being able to go to work, needing to go to work, and it be a job that has a lot of drudgery, and your manager doesn't really care about you as a person. There's just that sense of. Then on the positive side, though, everyone I think has stories of like a manager or a boss. I'm not talking about employee ownership at all, just in the world of work where it's like life-changing almost to have a boss that treats you with that level of dignity and kindness and care for you. It's like all other than parents and teachers, it's the boss that's the third person that's referenced as like a mentor, someone who really transformed my life. And as I got a taste and a sense of the power of that in the workplace, that became almost like, I don't know if addiction's too strong, but I love it when people in our company or in any company, like, they come alive at work because they feel like their voice matters and they're cared about, and it enables thriving in the workplace that I'm just really passionate about.
Of course, being an ESOP is core to this. In your case, one might argue that you could set such a culture without actually having it be baked into the capital stack.
Absolutely. I don't think you have to have an employee-owned company to create. I mean, there are many, many stories, I think, of businesses that have created phenomenal cultures without employee ownership at all. And it's largely, I believe, based on these types of principles of how to think about people and dignity at work.
Great, Chris. Okay, so I think we're moving into kind of the second or final chapter, at least for today's conversation, of the advent of the Holdco. So I guess, take us up to 2020?
Yeah, so 2019-ish, we were really starting to think about where we wanted to go from here. The business had grown significantly. We had amassed a balance sheet that was building assets, let's say, that would need to be invested and deployed. We had grown through acquisition a little bit at the textile at TVF. We had accomplished a small add-on of a competitor that was a successful transaction. And we had an appetite to keep growing. So we explored, some options, and ultimately the idea of a diversified Holdco kind of came to mind.
Not cliche, from Twitter, not because it was cool.
No, it was a little too early for that. Yeah. I was excited to come across all the Twitter and everything, a few years later. And it has been so helpful for me. But it was the cliche Berkshire Hathaway, that's a pretty cool kind of model. And, it came to mind. And it's a textile company that became a Holdco. So
that's right. That's right.
For what it's worth. So yeah, I recommended it as a path to our board, and our leadership team talked about it, and we got excited about it. For me personally, it was also exciting because my favorite experiences to that point were kind of the creation of the ESOP at the beginning. Like that process of bringing this as a solution for a business owner and for the employees. It was the most rewarding experience professionally for me. So repeating that became something I craved. And also we thought it would be great for the business because not only are we going to invest and deploy our assets, and grow them through this path, hopefully, it would bring diversification, which ESOPs, while I'm a huge fan of them, I do think one of the downsides can be a successful ESOP, lasts many years, and then maybe it gets to the end of a nice run. Some folks start retiring. Does the business falter or even run into a huge problem? And now all these folks who've banked their retirement on this ESOP account, it's concentrated. And, I think I like the idea of diversified ESOP as a way to mitigate that. Yeah.
Very important point. That it's totally it's basically your entire benefit plan, your entire retirement plan is basically stock in a single company, in a small, fragile compared to public markets, fragile company at that.
Yep.
You said it had been the most gratifying thing in your career to make the ESOP at this point in your career, 2020, looking back, and you wanted to do that again. So meaning what? A big strategic shift that was an enormous needle mover is what you mean? Because you're not doing the ESOP over again. You're talking about doing a Holdco.
Right.
So what did you mean by
bringing
repeating
the employee ownership to companies? Yeah. So we essentially launched as a Holdco at that point in 2020. And for me, the idea of finding additional companies where a business owner needs to sell and helping them bring employee ownership to their population. In our case, not by creating a new ESOP. In our case, it's their employees when we acquire a company, join our existing ESOP. But it's still an employee ownership outcome. And that's really the gratification for me, is solving that seller's need to sell and bringing employee ownership to their population.
Gotcha. Okay. So this is fascinating, Chris. And I also think this is where, this is just going to be really, for people who are a little bit further along in their journey who are listening, a very interesting model. So TVF is an ESOP. You are sitting on a lot of assets after a great decade run. You're figuring out what to do. You decide you need to kind of become a capital allocator of those assets and realize that as much stock appreciation as there's been, or valuation appreciation as there's been at TVF. You need to diversify that to protect everybody's nest egg. So you decide to build a Holdco. So TVF becomes the foundational opco of a Holdco. Which, by the way, as an aside to the listener, with how cool and desirable Holdcos are these days, it is putting the cart before the horse. Typically, the way Holdcos evolve is out of an opco. So there's a profitable operating company already. And then it's probably a similar trajectory to what you went through, Chris, where there's a profitable operating company and the decision is made, what makes sense to do with all this cash that's coming home? Oh, let's do a Holdco structure, diversify into other businesses. Therefore, you create a Holdco one level higher. But so the Holdco actually springs out of the foundational, very profitable opco, and then that Holdco entity then goes and buys the other opcos. Whereas on Twitter, what it is I'm going to start a Holdco, an empty vessel, and put opcos into it. Not to be too sarcastic with people, but I think it's important to keep in mind. Okay, so and then finally the ESOP move that you'd made in 2010 was so gratifying for you in that moment. You'd seen it work so well for another decade. I mean, really a tested model here. It wasn't just going to be a Holdco. It was going to be a Holdco where you acquire other businesses using a similar ESOP buyout of the seller that you had for TVF, and then all of those acquired employees become ESOP employees. And not each of those opcos wasn't going to be its own ESOP. In fact, you made the Holdco itself an ESOP. Maybe you touched on that, but say more about that. I'm remembering this from the Holdco, from the pre-call.
Yeah. So mechanically, all we did was take this TVF ESOP trust, which owns the shares, and we renamed it the Empowered Ventures ESOP Trust, and we wedged a holding company into the ownership structure above the OPCO, exactly as you suggested. So Empowered Ventures was a newly formed corporation wedged in between. And now any new companies that we buy or assets, we also have purchased some real estate, a little bit of real estate, becomes a subsidiary of the Empowered Ventures holding company. And any of the companies that are underneath Empowered Ventures, the employees all are just equal, not equal in percentage, but equal in terms of they have the full right of employee ownership in the holding company ESOP when they come into the plan. To be specific, they will start accruing shares over time. So they start with 0, and then every year they'll get an allocation. Everyone that's already been here for a long time has already built up shares. So that's how that will work.
Give us a picture of what does the Holdco look like today? How many opcos in it? Size to the extent you can share.
Yeah, so we've acquired 4 more businesses since 2020. So now we're up to 5 total businesses. We're well above 100 million in total revenue. So we've grown the overall enterprise, let's say from 2010 to where we're at today. So the initial, company, TVF, to where we're at today, we're roughly 4 times, revenue from where we were back then. And we're around 300 people. So we're not huge by any means in terms of number of people, but we've added 4 companies. The first was a precision machine shop near Cleveland, Ohio, called First Star Precision. Great business, great kind of business owner that selected us for the right reasons. And it's been a lot of fun. I would say we're still very much in this learning phase. We're 4 or 5 years in. This is a long-term thing for us. I think the value creation that's going to come from these acquisitions is going to take place steadily over time. But we love all the businesses we've acquired, mostly manufacturing and trades companies, construction. That's really our focus, even though diversification writ large is our goal. It's still within, let's say, 2 pillars: manufacturing and B2B kind of industrials, and then construction and trades is our comfort zone for now. But we're pretty pleased, with the growth that we've achieved so far these first 4 or 5 years. But M&A is hard work. It's been quite a journey and a lot of learning for sure.
And so just to revisit the size of the Holdco today, 5 total businesses, over 100 million in revenue, over 200 million in revenue?
No, we're saying the 120 to 150 million range, let's say at this point.
Okay, great. And is TVF the largest of the businesses?
TVF is still the largest of our companies, but we've made so much progress. It's not let's say the majority, or it's increasingly not the majority of our overall revenue. Yeah,
coming down below toward and maybe below 50% of
being
total.
Below 50% soon. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what of the four acquisitions, the 4 other opcos that you've acquired, what is the range of revenue sizes there and EBITDA sizes there?
Yeah, they fall within basically our target criteria that we generally are shooting for, 2 million EBITDA up to 5, 6, 7 million EBITDA in our range. The first couple businesses that we acquired were more in the 1 to 2, kind of range, and then we've kind of moved upstream a little bit, and that's intentional. So we're definitely excited to, be bringing on new companies that are 2, 3, 4 million versus below that. That's been a shift in our strategy over the last couple of years. And then revenue wise, we're talking about businesses between 7 and 30 million, pretty wide range.
And the shift in your strategy to buy larger EBITDA businesses, is that for the obvious discovery that larger is easier?
It's not necessarily easier in a certain sense. I mean, all the businesses are great businesses that have common challenges for the size that we're talking about. But I think the main difference between buying a 1 million EBITDA company versus a 3 is when the necessary investments are less of a burden on the financials. If you hire 2 key executives of a $3 million EBITDA company, that's not the same percentage of your budget as a 1 million. So it's really an ability to move a little faster and have less volatility ultimately, and kind of the budget is the main experience in our case. Even if we're still talking about businesses that when they join us, there's a lot of growth and foundation building that's going to need to take place for the business to be ready to get to the next level. We think starting with a little bit heftier, business is just probably ultimately the better foundation for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So can you kind of very brief version of the story of one of these acquisitions and how the whole ESOP and particularly how the ESOP element played and how how the seller took to it? Walk us through another of you applying this framework that you so fell in love with outside of TVF.
Yeah. I'll tell the story of our third diversifying acquisition, which is Benor Plumbing, Heating, and Air Conditioning. It's based in Burlington, Vermont area. And Benor came on our radar kind of through a broker, but they weren't fully on market, let's say. And the business owner really, really cared about what would happen to the company, after a transaction. And also common to pretty much all of our situations, he didn't have his succession planning fully figured out. And so we have been and are increasingly, continuously comfortable with working with a business owner over a period of time to help them navigate the actual succession process, as long as they're willing to commit, to a meaningful time frame. So we ended up talking with Brad Benor, the owner, former owner, and he loved our model, the employee ownership model, our partnership model through this succession planning process, and also our hands-off operating model. So we view ourselves more as stewards of companies than operators. And that's how we build our playbook, is how do we steward effectively? All these things really appealed to Brad. So, almost about a year ago, in April of 2024, we acquired Benor, and the employees were not aware of what was happening. It's pretty common, we experience what a lot of buyers experience, which is no one knows what's going on yet. We went in and partnered with, supported Brad in making an announcement to the company on the day of the transaction. And we were met with what's common for us is a lot of skepticism. It's not an immediate, oh yeah, we're employee owned. I have no idea what this actually means. It sounds too good to be true. There's got to be a catch. That's the common, a lot of things, skepticism. But what we've experienced and part of our differentiation, we feel like as a buyer, is the employees are more open-minded about it. They're definitely like intrigued on average, and they want to see it through and see what's going on. We've never had any key employees leave any of our companies in the first year, which has been a really nice, maybe it's a little bit of luck, but we feel like the employee ownership piece has helped that a lot. So what we typically do then is follow up that initial announcement with some information for them to read, share with their families, their spouse, kind of try to understand what's going on. A lot of them will go and check out our website and my podcast, which we might talk about later. But we try to help them kind of gather as much information as they can and gather their questions. And then we come back a few weeks later and we do a really in-depth presentation. We call it a "What's in it for me" presentation. And we go into all the mechanics of what's going on, how this really works. We share a little bit about what's possible. Like we show like, here's how your account value could look over time if we all continue to make this successfthat And if it hits certain targets and things, like it's pretty eye-popping numbers if someone stays for 10, 20 years. And that we find really helps people get a better understanding of what they're part of. But ultimately it still takes time. Like they want to see that first statement, which typically is going to take more than a year. They want to see it as a real number and has a dollar sign in front of it. And 2, 3, 4 years in is when we find that people really settle in and say, yeah, this is real. And I'm really happy to be part of this.
Thank you for that, Chris. Your point about, let's talk about the Empowered Ventures being a vessel, a steward of these holdcos, and you don't get very involved operationally. Of course, classic Warren Buffett, lots of decentralization. But so much of the TVF success was about culture. Do you try to change the culture of these businesses, and how so if you're not involved operationally? Or is that something that you basically pre-screen for? You don't buy a business where you feel like the culture needs a lot of work.
Yeah, it's all definitely a work in process. So this is not. We're still ironing all this out, and I think finding a really good way in our operating model. It's really a couple different things. So very important who we pick as the leader of the business. I mean, that's the leverage point of any company ultimately. So identifying the right person who's going to kind of foster the culture that is positive and consistent with an employee ownership culture. So to answer the question, like in terms of are we wanting to change the culture? Yes, we want to evolve the culture to embody and embrace the employee ownership component, so there does need to be some amount of additional information sharing and just kind of following some of these playbook elements of employee-owned companies that have been successful to create an ownership sense in the population. But we don't want to change the culture in the sense of what's the secret sauce that's made this company successful. Things like, what's the relationship like between the company and the customers? Like, we don't want to try to change things that are super important to how each business operates.
Your role now, Chris, as president of a Holdco, I'm reminded of the book, The Outsiders, which we talked about, which we touched on in the pre-call, which is, for people who don't know, a book about profiles, a handful of CEOs who are overlooked by the business press, the mainstream business press. They're known, but they're not the rock stars that we often hear about, and yet delivered outsized returns. And so what were their secrets? Really fascinating number of case studies. But the key theme of that book is that the CEOs that deliver the best returns for shareholders saw themselves as capital allocators, saw themselves as, frankly, investors, intelligently deploying the financial resources of the company. Is that how you see yourself now?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that is one of the big learnings of these last 4 years is small businesses aren't giant, large public companies that are just, you're just allocating capital. They are messy. It's the classic, they're messy. They do need support, a lot of support. It's hard work. Our leaders are awesome people and have like absolute best intentions for their companies. And they are charged with something extremely difficult. And so I think my respect for them and my appreciation for them has only grown in that we need to make sure we're supporting them in that effort, because there's too much in small business to handle. It's back to my initial lesson with TVF. I don't want them to feel like they're all on their own in this effort either. So that's where the stewarding has kind of evolved from, let's say, a capital allocator, hands-off concept at the beginning of being a Holdco to still not hands-on, but very engaged and supportive while staying in the back seat from a day-to-day perspective. I think that's how we're continuing to kind of find what that right balance is to support our leaders effectively.
We're starting to wrap up here, Chris. Let's return now to just some of the theory and practice of ESOPs generally. I get the sense from the way, you said it explicitly, that these are long-term, you're building a long-term Holdco here, and your acquisitions are long-term, kind of patient, compounding capital allocation moves. Is that intrinsic to ESOPs, the kind of the long-termism of it, or just the way that you've structured and powered?
Most ESOPs have an intention to perpetually be ESOPs, yes. But ESOPs sell as well. So in the country, roughly 250 to 300 new ESOPs get created every year, which is not a huge number. And there are only about 6,500 ESOPs in the country. And about the same number of ESOPs, 250 to 300, sell every year as well. And usually ESOPs that sell, they've reached some sort of natural end point. Maybe they've outgrown, their ability to be a small, player and being in an industry that being a big player is important. So they do need, for competitive reasons, to join up with another firm. Or, they're an ESOP company that has kind of gotten to the end of a leadership, group, their term, and there's maybe the succession planning hasn't been strong. And so they need to sell just for succession planning reasons. And there are other reasons. ESOPs that are very successful create a large need for future cash outflows to pay off all these employee owners. And if they don't do a phenomenal job of planning for all those cash outflows, they can actually have a cash crunch around all the payoffs that need to happen. So there are a lot of reasons ESOPs sell, but most do intend to stay ESOPs perpetually, is what I've found.
And an ESOP selling would simply mean that on the statement of all the employees and what their allocation of the employee equity is in aggregate is total equity of the business, and some other entity comes along and acquires it. Just like there's really nothing special about buying an ESOP versus buying any other business.
Not really. Yeah. The negotiation is with the trustee and the leadership team. Some ESOPs do have a provision in the plan where selling the company basically is the one thing that the employees all get to vote on. That's a wrinkle that can be interesting to hear about how that plays out in ESOP sales.
And it would be an important moment to reiterate what you said earlier, which is that it's financially democratic, an ESOP. It is not governance democratic.
Generally,
as a
no.
rule.
Best practice is it's kind of a professional governance model with a board and a leadership team. There are a few ESOPs out there that have embraced more highly democratic forms of governance, but it's pretty rare.
I loved how you called out to me how ESOPs could be relevant to our community of searchers and independent sponsors. Speak to that explicitly now, please.
Yeah, I've thought of a few ways. One way is that they probably come across ESOPs that occasionally in their searches for companies to maybe acquire, and just understanding the reasons why an ESOP may sell at sometimes I think could come into play. Because there are some cases where maybe buying a majority position of an ESOP company, but continuing the ESOP in a minority position could actually be a great foundation for taking an employee-owned company to the next level. To, again, where maybe one of the downsides of ESOPs, there, like everything, there are downsides, upsides and downsides. One of the other downsides for some ESOP companies is they can get a little conservative. So this very protective mindset of we've built this ESOP, but we don't want to put it at risk. So leadership can become a little bit conservative, and that's not great for longevity. So maybe an entrepreneurial person could come across an ESOP that has stagnated and make a play to buy a minority or majority stake, keep the ESOP in place because the culture can be really helpful in leadership. And maybe take it to the next level. So I think that's definitely a possibility that could come across. The other flip side to it is ESOPs can be a really useful exit option to at least consider. I definitely don't think they're the right ESOP or the right exit option in all cases, but at least knowing how that could work, what the pros and cons of an ESOP exit might be, I think are at least worth considering. There are tax benefits to ESOP transactions for the seller if done properly, that can defer the gains, indefinitely. Similar, like it's a 1042. It's very similar to the real estate, deferral process. So there's definitely reasons to at least consider, an ESOP sale, in my opinion, when an exit is going to be accomplished.
And you're speaking now to those searchers and sponsors who are already in their businesses, who have already acquired, and now are thinking, how might I exit this business at some point?
Yep. I think an ESOP sale is not going to be highly competitive in an industry that has extremely high multiples. But if a business is going to sell for 4 to 6 times, an ESOP sale is probably going to be competitive structure. There's ways to structure it to make it competitive if it's in that kind of common range. So it could very, very much be at least worth including in the options, in my opinion.
And this is an important point, arguably a downside of ESOPs, that when the entity valuation, the stock value everybody has a piece of, is set by a valuation firm, by a third party, and based on comps, as you said, and analysis. But so often, or almost always, when there's a phenomenal exit, it's because there's been some sort of auction process, or there's just multiple parties who want to get their hands on this business, and it's for whatever reason, and it's bid up. So that is something that sort of premium would not be an eventuality that an ESOP could enjoy, because you're getting this sort of quote unquote objective market value of the business, which is never going to see some outsized valuation.
True. Yeah. ESOPs are probably not the right exit option for absolute top dollar. I would say that there are investment banks that specialize in ESOPs and including them as an option in a full spectrum, process, and just seeing how competitive it can be. And then that tax benefit can be an offsetting or additional, non-traditional factor in consideration ultimately that could make it equal in net value over time. So it just really depends on the situation. But yeah, a really high multiple sale of a business based on a strategic premium is probably going to be higher than an ESOP outcome for sure.
Yeah. And the tax benefit you just referred to now was the seller selling his business or her business to an ESOP.
Correct.
Let's return to the other tax benefit of ESOPs, which I said we would get back to. This is important. So it becomes Chapter S entity.
Yeah, if you choose. So ESOPs can be either an S or a C corp. If you choose to have it be an S corp, and if it owns 100%, then it is a 100% tax deferred entity, essentially.
And so what that means is of the earnings of the cash that it's generating every year, fully 40% that would otherwise go to taxes can be reinvested in the business.
Yep.
So this is huge. It's like it is having 40% more capital to reinvest in the business every year, which presumably if you have a great outlet for that cash, a great place to put that cash and reliably grow the business, you will dramatically accelerate the growth of that business. So while there are maybe ESOPs dampen some of the financial realization in certain ways, the overall entity is likely to compound much faster because it's got 40% more earnings to play with and reinvest every year. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think of it as almost our form of float. It's like an insurance company, and that cash that's sitting there that you can reinvest. It's our version of that. And of course you have to do well with that, for it to really matter in the long run. But it's a structural advantage from a capital perspective that has been very meaningful for us. And I know for a lot of ESOPs out there.
And does it not automatically increase the valuation by 40% of the business? Because now EBITDA is 40% higher?
It's a great question.
Is my math right? It's whatever. It's 40% over, say, whatever the math is there. I might be getting my ratios wrong, but.
Yeah, no, it doesn't, because valuation advisors will do a capital neutral valuation. They'll basically they'll presume it's a C corp, and they'll kind of adjust everything to assume that this is actually a C corp.
I see. Okay. Any other downsides to ESOPs?
Downsides, it's that it is more of that professional governance. I don't have total control of Empowered Ventures. I report to a board of directors. So, it does mean a more collaborative leadership approach and a lack of control for the CEO, even though I do run the business day to day. That's just one factor I think that's important to note.
Wait, I'm sorry, Chris. Why is that? Because you don't own 51% of the business? Whereas
Correct.
Okay. But again, in most businesses of any size, few people, it's quite rare that anybody does own 51%. That would only be in a very small business, SBA style acquisition. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. But there is a sense though that, and maybe you were about to say this if I'm taking the words out of your mouth, it's not explicitly a democracy, but there is sort of a democratic tone to things. So while it's not baked into, it's not codified in governance rules, there's an expectation in the culture that kind of happens in the culture that it's collaborative decision making. Say more.
Yeah, if done well, and if in our case, if you create this culture where people feel really invested and engaged and feel this sense of ownership, the double-sided sword to that, or the other side to that is if there are moments when they aren't feeling like their voice is being heard or they're being taken seriously, you're inviting a level of accountability for management and leadership that doesn't always exist if employees just kind of know they're quote unquote just employees. So it does require leadership that is comfortable with that ambiguity of having a sense of accountability to everyone else in the business, and decisions are never certain. And so you're making decisions knowing you have to explain yourself to everyone to some degree. And that's not a comfortable thing for all leaders, probably.
Yeah. Again, however, that's not intrinsic to ESOPs. And so even if it's sort of intrinsic to any culture where you have made employees feel like they're really part of things. That's really, if you're able to even achieve that and have employees feel really invested in the organization, a consequence of that is that they're going to feel like they should have a voice. So it's actually, this is separate from commentary on ESOPs and more just about having a really bought in culture.
I think it's true. I do think it takes it to another level where employees are literally able to say, hey, I am an owner of this business. I have a voice. Like it does kind of edge it up even further, but I enjoy that. I think it is good to feel like I'm accountable to everyone as a steward of this business, but it's uncomfortable. So I think it's just there's a truth in the discomfort of that just, any leader would have to kind of be okay with.
Yeah. Costs of an ESOP.
Mm-hmm. There are some ongoing annual costs that other companies don't have to necessarily incur, paying the trustee on an annual basis, getting this annual valuation. Those are the two, main ones. Plus ESOPs do need to be audited just to kind of meet the regulations and stuff. So on the whole, depending on the size of the business, you're talking about an annual $100,000 to maybe $150,000 minimum, additional cost that a business would need to incur. It's pretty commonly thought that a business needs to be at least $1 million in annual EBITDA to even consider, being an ESOP. So yeah, there's definitely some additional cost in being an ESOP company.
Great, Chris. Before we have you plug your podcast, is there anything that we didn't get on about your story or about ESOPs broadly that you want to share?
Not really. I mean, I'm very happy to be a resource. If anybody just wants to talk ESOPs, runs across an ESOP situation, anything that they want to discuss, ESOP stuff is a weird and nuanced topic for sure. And I'm happy to be a resource for folks. I do think there's one really I've never heard of someone doing this, but in the ETA space, I think there's an intriguing idea that if I were starting from scratch now is what I would think about doing, which is to combine this. So you had a guest on at one point who mentioned using their 401k funds to buy the company. In theory, someone could do that and also create an ESOP at the same time, let's say, or buy an existing ESOP. And so, let's say you use your 401k funds to buy 40% of the company and 60% in ESOP. That could be 100% tax deferred entity still at that point. So there's this, just back to that mechanics of the float with the tax savings, it's theoretically possible to actually create an entity that continues to have that and isn't a 100% ESOP, which I just think is an intriguing idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can deep dive into that another day. I think I might have missed a detail or two there, but good food for thought. And your personality as an accountant showing there, thinking about
finishing on a technical topic. Yeah.
What is your podcast all about, Chris?
Empowered Owners is our little podcast. It's really for our employee owners. But it's kind of like an insight into our world that other folks outside have taken a look at. But again, it's more for our employees. We highlight our employee owners. It's a really fun way, I think, for leaders to kind of create a culture in a company that has like dispersed. We have companies all over, locations all over. So having a place to showcase internally for our employees, like to each other, it's been a fun way to go about doing that. So Empowered Owners.
But wait, the guests are not Empowered Venture owner employees.
They're employee owners.
All are.
And our leaders are, it's almost entirely been internal, guests at this point. It's possible we would do outside guests as well, but the target is to really help our employee owners feel connected and understand and know each other. So that's the primary purpose of the podcast.
And employee owners, is this the parlance in ESOP land? What employees are called? Employee owners?
Employee owners, worker owners. Yeah, that's generally the two. Yep.
And I've always thought that one great use case of a podcast is simply internal guests, and then in the audience is just the people within an organization. I'm sure such a thing exists, but I've never actually run across it as good an idea as it seems. Has it worked? Do you think people listen? What do you think? How would you?
It's worked. It's the smallest TAM in the world. We only have 300 employees, so our total addressable market is tiny. But yeah, I think we're getting about something along the lines of a third of our folks are tuning in consistently, which I think is pretty good. And it has served a purpose for external folks that I wondered if it might. So for example, one of the business owners that chose us, listened to a bunch of episodes and actually mentioned some things that were in the episodes as part of his reasons for ultimately getting comfortable with us. So it's that window into the business that outsiders actually can benefit from as well, even if it's an internal focused podcast in our experience.
Yeah. No, it seems like a great, it has a lot of great benefits. And like I said, I'm surprised it's not more widely done. Although again, maybe it is, and I just don't realize it. Chris Fredericks, thank you. You're really gifted at explaining this stuff. Very, very clear. Your 15 years of being a CEO and communicating to an organization, or maybe just your natural talent. But this was super clear. Great insight into how ESOPs work. Fascinating what you've built at TVF and now Empowered. So thanks for sharing it with us, audience. Here you have an ESOP expert and evangelist who's willing to talk to you. So respect his time, but if you have specific questions, reach out to him. Chris Fredericks, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Will. Appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed that interview. Don't forget to subscribe to the Acquiring Minds newsletter. We send an email for every episode with an introduction to the interview, a link to the video version on YouTube, and soon, key takeaways, numbers, and more essentials from the interview for those of you who don't have time to listen or watch it. Subscribe at acquiringminds.co. You'll also find all our webinars there on the website, both those we have coming up and recordings of past webinars. At this point, there are over 30 webinar recordings, a wealth of information on all the technical nitty-gritty of buying a business. acquiringminds.co.